My name is Jessica Winiger, and I am the interim director of the Kaplan Humanities Institute this year, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to this signature event of our Truth Dialogues. As many of you know, each year the Kaplan Institute selects a theme to anchor and connect current conversations on campus. And so for this year, our Humanities Council selected the timely theme of truth. This was partly in response to our era of historical amnesia, fake news, and climate change denial, and partly as a way to think through how we as scholars can and should respond to the mainstream challenges to truth-telling when we actually invented the critique of truth with a capital T. And we've already co-sponsored a number of important conversations on this topic this fall across a range of departments and programs. Just a few weeks ago in this room, we had Nancy McLean speak about her new book, Democracy in Chains, Stephen Lukes on bullshit, Katha Pollitt on fake news and abortion, and Linda Zerilli on democratic judgment in an age of alternative facts. In 2 weeks on November 15th, we'll also have historian Benjamin Madley speak on U.S. empire, genocide, and the California Indians. And we have a number of other events in our Truth Dialogues in the winter and the spring, including Jane Mayer, the New York writer and exposing the Koch brothers, and the historian of science Naomi Oreskes on climate change denial. And so you can find the full schedule of events and Truth Dialogues at humanities.northwestern.edu or just Google Kaplan Institute. But tonight we are deeply honored to feature Natasha Trethewey and Carol Anderson in conversation with Leslie Harris. There's perhaps no better trio to discuss the intersections of poetry, history, race, and truth. All three of these remarkable women have pushed the boundaries of the sayable and knowable in their art and scholarship. They've given us new ways to understand how past hidden truths have come to shape American society as it exists today. Whether that is the, quote, unspoken truth of our racial divide, as Carol Anderson calls it in her recent book, that is the truth of white supremacy, or whether it is the evidence, as Natasha Trethewey writes in a poem about violence against women, particularly a black woman. This is the evidence found not on, quote, the fleeting bruises she covered with makeup, but rather on the landscape of her body, splintered clavicle, pierced temporal, her thin bones settling a bit each day, the way all things do. Along with Leslie, renowned for her own public initiatives linking the legacy of slavery with education, both Natasha and Carol bring the conversations around truth to broad publics beyond the academy. In doing so, their work provokes us white Americans, I'm pointing to me, not saying a universal us white Americans to acknowledge and sit in the discomfort that historical truths with a capital T gave us nearly unbreakable privilege. And their work forces us to work beyond that towards redress. And they all brilliantly attend to the way that these racial truths are inextricably shaped by class and gender, as well as geography, which is very important in their work. And this is complex, difficult work that they are doing, and we are just thrilled to be witness to that this evening. I'm going to give a rather long introduction to Natasha and Carol's work, because not all of you may have read their work, although of course many of you have, just so that there's some context for this conversation between the three of them. So Natasha Trethewey, as many of you know, is now Board of Trustees, Professor of English. Welcome to Northwestern. She's the author of numerous collections of poetry and creative nonfiction. Her first collection, Domestic Work, from 2000, won the Cave Canem Prize for a first book by an African-American poet. Domestic Work explores the lives and jobs of working-class people, particularly black men and women in the South. Trethewey combines the personal and the historical in her work, particularly in Belloc's Ophelia from 2002. It's about a fictional prostitute in New Orleans in the early 1900s. And for this book, Trethewey researched the lives of the women in the red light district, many of whom were mixed race. Her third book of poems, Native Guard from 2006, is astonishing. It won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. The book contains elegies to her mother, and I read you part of a poem from that collection, and also contains a sonnet sequence in the voice of a black soldier fighting in the Civil War. She also does creative nonfiction, including Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and also has a more recent poetry collection called Thrall, which examines historical representations of mixed-race families, focusing on fathers and children. And that is a series of poems that engages the tradition of portrait art in the 18th century, so it has a visual component as well. Trethewey's many honors and awards include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Radcliffe Institute. She's had appointments at a number of institutions, but we're particularly glad to have her here at Northwestern. And of course, as we all know, in 2012, she was named Poet Laureate of the state of Mississippi, and also the 19th Poet Laureate of the United States.
Yes. 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 Feels
Dr. Carol Anderson is Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University, and her research and teaching focus on public policy, particularly the ways that domestic and international policies intersect with the issues of race, justice, and equality in the United States. She's author of the much-cited work, Eyes Off the Prize, the United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights, 1944 to 1955. And that was awarded both the Gustavus Myers and the Myrna Burnoff Book Awards. Her second monograph, whose title I love, is called Bourgeois Radicals. How many of us are? Bourgeois Radicals, the NAACP and the Struggle for Colonial Liberation, 1941 to 1960. And in that book, she uncovered the long-hidden and important role of the nation's most powerful civil rights organization in the fight for liberation of peoples of color in Africa and Asia. Her most recent work, which is a New York Times bestseller from 2016 and recently republished with a new afterword, is called White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Nation's Divide. It was the National Book Critics Circle Award winner, New York Times bestseller, New York Times Notable Book of the Year, Washington Post Notable Nonfiction Book of the Year, Boston Globe Best Book of 2016, and Chicago Review of Books Best Nonfiction Book of 2016. Let's just do a round of applause for that. So this book explains in large measure why we can view the Trump election as whitelash, the term coined by Van Jones that awful night. The book actually began with a 2014 remarkable op-ed in the Washington Post, which became, I think, the most cited op-ed that year. And it was published during Ferguson, and it argued that while the dominant white media was talking about the Ferguson protests as black rage, Dr. Anderson says, no, actually, it's white rage. It's white rage at work. With so much attention on the flames, she argued, everyone had ignored the kindling.
Yes.
And that book, built off of that op-ed, takes us from 1865 to the present, identifying every flashpoint when African Americans made advances towards full participation in U.S. political life, and argued that white reaction after every one of these has fueled a deliberate and relentless rollback of their gains. From Reconstruction to the Black Codes and Jim Crow, from the Supreme Court's landmark Brown decision in 1954, to the shutting down of public schools throughout the South while taxpayer dollars financed segregated white private schools. She also looks at the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and how they abetted then the Southern strategy and the war on drugs that we know disenfranchised millions of African Americans and propelled Nixon and Reagan into the White House. Throughout all of these, she shows how relentless white rage has been, even as its truth has remained invisible. Well, invisible to some of us. Her research has garnered substantial fellowships and grants, including from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Ford Foundation, the National Humanities Center. Oh, I have a long list here. She's also served on working groups dealing with race, minority rights, and criminal justice at the Aspen Institute, the United Nations, and at Stanford. She's also a member of the U.S. State Department's Historical Advisory Committee. Well, was. Yeah, the different administration.
Was.
And is currently...
No.
And hopefully again soon. And is on the board of directors of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. And last but not least, Dr. Leslie Harris, who is our own professor of history at Northwestern, who has agreed to launch this conversation, is also a truth teller on these topics. Her first book, In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863, examined the impact of Northern and Southern slavery on the definitions of class, gender, citizenship, and political activism among New York's blacks and whites. And this work led to her participation in the New York Historical Society's groundbreaking exhibition, Slavery in New York, which I know we're clapping a lot, but I believe also
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
That was fantastic. Groundbreaking exhibition and a groundbreaking accompanying book. And she's also led and participated in such a large number of public history initiatives having to do with the legacies of slavery and the university, challenges around racial and other forms of human diversity in higher education more generally. And she's currently working on a book on New Orleans, actually, that uses Hurricane Katrina and her family's history as a way to interrogate the history of African Americans in the city from the 19th century to the present. So that was a very long introduction. I'm sure you're eager to hear all of them speak in more personal and conversational ways about these amazing accomplishments and to think about the relationship between poetry, history, race, and truth in this moment. But before I turn it over, I have some quick thank yous. The co-presenters for this event, the Departments of African American Studies, English, and History, the Chabraja Center for Historical Studies, and the Creative Writing Program. I'd also, of course, love to thank the Kaplan staff members, Tom Burke, Jill Manor, and Megan Scored, for all they did for this event and all of our events in the Truth of Dialogues. I'd also like to acknowledge the work study students and the catering and cleaning staff for all that they do to nourish our scholarship. And so after this conversation, we will have time for a Q&A, and I invite you all to stay for a lovely reception afterwards. So welcome again to the Truth Dialogues, and let's give a warm welcome to our guests.
So some of you might have seen us hug each other. We've known each other for a very long time, a really long time. I first met Natasha as she was, as Bellows Ophelia was coming out shortly after. Let's see, I have it on. It's not coming up. It's turned on?
I think it is on. Yeah, it's green.
on.
It's green. It's green. Okay.
How about that?
No.
Still not on.
Just not loud enough.
How about that? How about that? A little better, but not, yeah, I can hear it a little bit, but not enough.
How's this one? How's it now?
There.
Hi, Damon.
Okay. Try yours once.
Hi.
Is that okay?
It's better? Okay.
We're just going to leave that one off then?
Okay. So I first met Natasha around the time you published Bellows Ophelia. I hired Carol to Emory. It was the best hire of my career. So I'm really thrilled that we're here, though, because I don't think we ever in all that time got a chance to talk to each other about the work that we do, even though we've been deeply influenced, I think, by each other in all kinds of ways. And I know I've greatly admired the intellectual work and the writing that both of you do. I also, though, want to mark this moment, the fact that 3 black women are sitting up here in this particular moment, when for most of U.S. history, black women have stood as the opposite of truth tellers, as people not to be listened to and paid attention to. So, of course, as a scholar of slavery, I have to think about the ways in which, because of race and gender, that is the position we occupy. We're certainly in a dark time right now where we imagine that we're not making progress, but this right here is a sign of progress. What we have already built, many of us, and not just us, but we stand for a lot of scholars and other people who have done this work, and that can't be taken away. So I just really want to say that profoundly, and to recognize that Natasha held the Phyllis Wheatley Chair at Emory as the first chair she held. Carol currently holds the Charles Howard Candler Chair. I think Phyllis Wheatley might have been able to imagine this. Candler, I'm not sure, but but it's good to be surprised. So there has been progress made, and there's progress that won't be taken away. All right, so I have 3 sets of questions that I want us to talk about. The first is facts versus truth, or facts and truth. I know Carol doesn't like that. We'll get there.
Okay.
How historians make sense of and interpret facts, and what do they mean when they say truth. And for this, and Natasha, I'm including you as an historian. I've always thought of you as an historian. Anyway, I'll talk about that in a second. The second set of questions is about writing for the public and how that impacts the kinds of truths that you decide to tell, what you decide to engage in, or the pushback you might get to what you're talking about. The third is about emotional truths in both of your works. And then a final set of questions, again, if we have time, about truths, again, in your work, kind of circling back. So the first I want to start with is facts and truth. So if you're on a plane, someone says, what do you do for a living? You say you're an historian. They say, oh, I love history. I love the stories. It's great. Or they go, oh, I hate history. All those facts. I have to memorize all the dates. And yet, both of you demonstrate the highest level of what it means to be a historian, which is not simply lining up facts, taking your note cards and publishing them in a book, but the interpretive piece, the delving through the facts to find the truths. So facts are only part of the beginning of the work you do. How do you think about facts and moving from the facts that you find, the documents, to truths in your work? Or do you start with a sense of the truth and then you find things that force you to change what you thought was a truth? How do you think about those 2 things in your work?
So with my work, I usually start with a hypothesis, which is, I think something's going on. You know how you're looking and it just looks like something's happening over there and you're not quite sure what's happening over there, but you know something's happening over there. And so I start off with, ooh, something's happening over there. But before and then I do the kind of work that we're trained to do, where we're reading as much of the literature as we can. But often, because we're asking, my field is actually diplomatic history. Cold War U.S. foreign policy. And the kinds of questions that I would ask, diplomatic historians weren't asking. So there really wasn't a secondary literature field to mine through. And so I knew something was happening somewhere over there. But then I would get into the archives. And so I'm asking questions like, who would know this? Who are their friends? Who's talking to whom? Can I read some diaries? And doing that kind of deep work and making sure that, because one of the things that happens as a historian, and what we have to be very careful of, is that, the first story you hear is the one that you think is the truth. And so then you have to ping everything off of that first story in order for it to make some sense. It's like, okay, well, so-and-so said this, da-da-da. And so what I do then is I don't listen to the first story. Mm-hmm. In fact, I blend all of those stories together chronologically as I'm mining through all of this stuff when I'm organizing it. So I just don't read everything the State Department said or everything the NAACP said, because I know that's not the truth. Not that I'm saying the NAACP is lying or that the State Department is lying.
Mm-hmm. All the time.
All the time. Okay, and this is what it was like in department meetings. But that by combining it all together to see it unfold in real time, that helped me understand what was going on and where the gaps were, who was lying, why they were lying, because I could begin to see as I'm putting all of these pieces together, which meant then that I couldn't have a thin research base. It meant that I had to go as deeply as I could. And we know that there are silences there. I'm just going to tell a quick story. Mm-hmm. So in Bourgeois Radicals, yes, and I love that title too. In Bourgeois Radicals, there was this moment where Channing Tobias, who was the head of the NAACP, the chairman of the board, he was also chairing the U.S. delegation to the UN dealing with colonial issues. And South Africa is getting ready to blow up big, and this is 1951. And there's this moment where Walter White, who's the head of the NAACP, says, "How'd the meeting go?" And Channing went, "Sometime a man gotta do what a man gotta do." And I went, "Ooh, what'd you do?" Right? Yeah. And so I'm all up in the NAACP papers because they dot every I and cross every T. You know when somebody sneezed in the NAACP. Silence. Not nary a word about what a man got to do. I was like, "Honey, you don't know who I am." I hopped on a plane and went to Minnesota, where Channing Tobias's papers are. And I'm going through those papers, and it's like, ooh, ooh, ooh. And then right at that moment, right the day before the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting, silence. The papers have been purged. I was like, "Son, I will hunt you down." And I hopped on a plane and I went to DC and got into the State Department papers. Record Group 59 is the largest collection in the National Archives. And I'm hunting and I'm hunting and I'm hunting. And there's this is probably the only existing copy. The British are furious with Channing Tobias. Foreign Minister Anthony Eden will be contacting the Secretary of State. Just thought you should know. What, you don't have any attachments? I don't know what he did, but sometime a man got to do what a man got to do. I hopped on a plane and I went to Britain. And I got into the British National Archives, and I'm hunting, and there's the Channing Tobias file. Ooh. 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 It was good. It was so good. So the British and the Americans had concocted this deal because the UN was getting ready to invite the Herreras, Namas, and Bergdamaras, the African peoples themselves, to present to the UN directly, without an intermediary, without anybody doing their voice, to talk about what South Africa was doing to them directly. This is this is like landmark, this is earth-shattering. And they had concocted a deal where the Americans were going to block it. So when one of the members of the American delegation got ready to stand up to block it, Channing said, "Sit down." And the guy was like, "Rrr." He said, "I said, sit down." I sat down because there's a hierarchy there and Channing was the chair. So the other guy was like, "I don't know what happened over there, but I'll do it." And he gets ready to stand up and Channing turned. And Channing was a minister. He said, "Sit down." I was like, "Okay." And he sat down and the British went, "What just happened here?" And it's like, "We had a deal." And I was like, "Ooh." And so it's in those silences, that something has just happened. And so it requires a kind of dogged determination. It requires this incredible quest to find whatever you can. And there'll be these little shards, just a little slip of paper with some notations on it here, just over there. But you keep following that path until you can get there. That's what we do. That is why, frankly, the work that we do becomes very dangerous in an alternative fact world. Because we are relentless.
Yeah, Carol, those silences you're talking about animate my work too, because I've been so interested in absences from the historical record, or from the way that things are taught in school or presented at a national park or on a monument. And I always begin as a poet with an historical question. that I pose to myself. And I'm always in the pursuit of truth, and so that will often take me as well to the archives. I think about Robert Hayden saying that he wrote in order to correct a lot of the misapprehensions in African American history. He wrote poetry in order to do that. And I do believe that poetry can function in that way. One of the things that I'm concerned about as we think about the pursuit of the facts, the evidence, that sometimes may have been redacted or erased in some other kind of way from the landscape in our monuments, from textbooks, is also the equal pursuit of truth and how those two things intersect. Because I find that I'm often writing about histories that are lesser known, that have been forgotten or erased, I don't want to play with the facts. I want to avoid historical anachronism in a poem. I mean, even though we think of a poem as a space where, because you're going for a larger truth, you might play with the facts. And I can talk about, poems in which I've changed the color of a dress my mother wore from white to blue because blue was better for the poem and the poem's truth. But when I'm writing about history, I don't want to mess with the facts. I do find, though, and for example, in all of the research I did for Native Guard, to try to find out something about those African American soldiers who were stationed off the coast of my hometown, to whom at that point no monument had been erected, whose story was left out when the park ranger gave a tour of the fort. People around the country didn't necessarily know about this history, even as professional historians had been working on this and talking about Black participation in the Civil War. There were, sort of lay people weren't hearing that history, so it might as well have been something that I was making up. And when we get to pushback, I can talk a little bit more about that. But I found that because I am trying to do the work of history in poems and to avoid historical anachronism, it served me better to create an imagined character who might have lived, and to place that character within the evidence, within the facts of history, so that what gets played out is something about the truth of the human condition and people's responses in times of struggle or war or oppression. And so it is a way of borrowing the tools of historian, the evidence-based research, and combining it with the tools of the imaginative writer, which I think historians must borrow too in some ways, that history is fiction and fiction as history, the speculation where you have to fill in the blanks when the record has been excised.
I want to pick up on that. Last spring, there was a celebration of Saidiya Hartman here, and one of the things that she writes about is this concept of critical fabulation. Now, Saidiya Hartman is a scholar of slavery like I am, and one of the challenges for the pre-20th century, although you spoke very well of the absences and gaps in the 20th century archive, but the pre-20th century archive seems to sometimes be all fragments, very few holes. And so she put forth this idea of critical fabulation, and this builds on what you said, in which, quote, we imagine what cannot be verified. It is an impossible writing which attempts to say that which resists being said. It is a history of an unrecoverable past. It is a narrative of what might have been or could have been. It is a history written with and against the archive. And so I was thinking about that and having both of you together, because I think 20th century historians tend to be very grounded. There are reams of paper often to go through, or videotape, or television. 19th century historians tend to be we have to be a little more interpretive and sometimes engage in this critical fabulation. But we don't go as far as poets go, necessarily. But I guess I just want to hear you play around a little bit with that idea. Like, what do we do with things that seem to be unrecoverable? What if you had not found the British Right. Welcome to my world. Right. So if you had not found that file,
You can't just make it up like I would.
And I think that is also, to me, it is one of the hardest pieces, because when I'm writing, my writing is somebody said journalistic in a book review. I think he thinks that's a slam, but I think it's a compliment. And so I'm a storyteller. I'm a storyteller in the way that I tell what's going on historically. And so there are moments where it would be where I want to, for drama's sake, right? But I'm like, if I don't know that this exactly was happening, I'm not writing it. My commitment to what's on that page being as evidence-driven, evidence-based as it must be, doesn't lend me to creating a woulda, coulda. I can't get there, and maybe it's my 20th century self, but or my historian self in the 20th century. So there are these holes. We know that there are these holes. We know that one of the problems in history as a discipline is that by being so archivally driven, it means that if there's not an archive with you in it, then you cease to exist. And so that requires us then to be more creative in terms of not just going to the National Archives, but in fact in looking at videos, in reading, going through like the Black press, because you will find people's lives in the Black press that aren't in the archives. It requires going through marriage licenses. It requires all of these other kinds of things that aren't archivally driven in order to be able to fill in those spaces. What my concern is and as historians we call this presentism. I think I put another T in there, but it's been a while since I had comps. Is that they know I'm crazy, so
we're with you.
Yeah. Is that it's difficult sometimes to craft your narrative when you don't have the documents. But you know that something is going on, but you have to pull back. You just have to pull back from that ledge, because we're in a moment where it's like, if you believe it, then it is so. And that is such a slippery slope, because that is where we are now as a nation, where evidence doesn't matter, facts don't matter for too large of a segment of our population, which therefore makes it very difficult to have any kind of real body politic discussion about how do we move forward in this if we cannot even agree, for instance, that Black folks are shot by the cops. If we can't even have that level of agreement on facts, then it makes it very difficult to move forward in terms of policy discussions. And so that's why when that first question came through on truth or facts, and I was like, Rrr. I was like, Leslie? And she's like, okay, Carol, take it down a notch. But so that's where my drive as a historian, and also seeing how folks who don't have the level of integrity that you have play fast and loose with that in order to create this alternative universe where, as long as I feel it, it's real.
because of the absence of some of those documents you're talking about, one of the things that I aimed to do was to create the historical document. That narrative in poems from that black soldier is indeed an imagined historical document. What's factual about it is that all of the battles, the skirmishes, the evidence that I used to construct it came from the records, the historical records. So it is as evidence-based as what you're talking about doing as a historian. And so with all of the evidence behind it, I create an imaginative character who could have been there to try to get at the truth of his condition and what he would have been thinking about, and to tell us something about the historical moment that you might only find in the diary or the letters of a soldier. And in order to create a believable, probable human being, of course, I had to read lots of diaries. I had to read, newspaper accounts, Walt Whitman writing about seeing the Native Guards on parade. All the kinds of ways that you would find this evidence, and yet I still felt compelled to put, a bibliography in the back of a collection of poems. And that was really important because I wanted people to know that this isn't just imagined, that this is indeed fact-based evidence. This is a character who might have lived, but all of the events that happen there are real events. They are facts, and they are true.
Yeah.
I want to pick up on that and talk then about public reception to what each of you do, which you're both presenting truths through hardcore fact-based history, through what I would say is critical fabulation, much more so. And you're both, I'm just going to take, I was going to ask you a question about this, but I'm just going to take as assumed, you had a mission to speak to the public, not just to speak to your colleagues in the historical profession or just to do a more academic or abstract kind of poetry, but to do a poetry that communicates to a broad public. In terms of, as you're trying to present these complicated ways of getting at the truth, right? Because you described this archival work, you've described all the, you put in the back, you want people to know this bibliography. What has been the response to that? How have people understood the truths that you're trying to impart? Do people want to engage at that level with you in exploring these kinds of truths?
One of the first responses that I had after I was on the NewsHour talking about historical memory and historical erasure, amnesia, our sort of collective amnesia around Black participation in the Civil War, I got emails from people. And this goes back to what you said about who's the truth tellers, who's sitting here right now being responsible finally for the truth. I got emails from people saying that they'd never heard of this history, and surely these soldiers didn't really exist. And if they did exist, then records would be in the National Archives. And I wrote back and said, they are in the National Archives. But what it said to me is that it was not only that it's a history that this person had not learned in whatever school they went to, I can imagine, because I went to Southern schools and there were plenty of things that were erased from our textbooks. Because this person didn't know it, didn't want to know it, also that I was the person telling it meant it couldn't be a valid history. It couldn't be true.
Exactly.
Something, and at that moment I was very glad that I had put all of the historical sources in the back of the book. But another thing happened, and this is before the book even came out. I got the proofs back from my publisher, and on the cataloging, the Library of Congress's cataloging information, I think it only said a few phrases, something like poetry, mothers, mixed race people, and that was it.
Nothing about
Civil War,
nothing.
Soldiers,
veterans, soldiers.
Not at all, not at all. And so I called my publisher and I said, this is really important. This doesn't say anything about the Civil War, black participation in the Civil War. And the young intern, no offense, nothing about interns, but she said, oh, don't worry, we're going to market the book like that. And I said, I don't think you understand. I said, I put that there for the researcher who goes into the archives, who goes into the library and is trying to find out, or just something, and somehow comes across my book.
Right.
They will have all the sources of where that I found things, so they can actually go to the work of historians if they don't know how to find it. And she said, no, that I think it's not going to be a problem. You're being really difficult. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to continue this relationship. But they sent it back to the copy editor, and he agreed. So then he sent it back to the Library of Congress, and they had to redo it. And so now it says black, Civil War, 1861, 1865, black participation. It says all these things. So now, if you look for that book, you will find all sorts of, and the history just keeps going. All the connections can be made, as opposed to it shutting down and it being yet another silence, another way of erasing
This is how it works.
and creating an absence or a break, a gap in the story.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's profound.
So I'll talk about white rage. I was already in a thing called the Op-Ed Project that, as you know, teaches faculty how to take their expertise and apply it in the public domain. And we were having a workshop that day, and I happened to have the TV on, and Ferguson is blowing up. And it didn't matter whether it was MSNBC, CNN, or Fox. They were all saying the same thing. Look at black people burning up where they live. Lord, can you believe black people are burning up where they live? Did you know black people were burning up where they live?
They always do that.
Don't they do this?
What's wrong with them?
I mean, I know. Okay, this is us at dinner. and that's us at dinner. And so, and all of this, look at black people burning up where they live, was the one is that you had the underlying narrative of black pathology. America would be fine if it weren't for black folk. And then you had the second piece, which was so ahistorical that it was right there in that moment of black people burning up where they live. Except I had lived in Missouri for 13 years. I taught at the University of Missouri. I know that state. And I know how systematically the state of Missouri and its public entities have worked to undermine the access of African Americans to their rights. And what we were seeing was the culmination of decades and decades and decades of that. And so it was the silence that I was hearing in the media, the ahistorical framing, the underlying narrative of just simple black pathology. Look at black folk acting up again. What are we gonna do with these black people? Because you know that was the subtext in those statements. And so as a historian, I said, let me put this thing into some historical context. And that's where the Washington Post op-ed came in, was to put what is happening in America into its historical frame. Because this is not a narrative about black pathology. Because when you think about what has been done in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, in terms of slavery, in terms of Jim Crow, in terms of James Crow Esquire, the fact that black folk are standing is a miracle. I'm going to go all Ernest Angley laying on hands here. This is a miracle because it should, given the depths of this, And so it has been, as I started to document this quest for education, this desire to have our babies have really good schools and to be able to get the kind of education that every child in America should have. That fire has been met with pure, unmitigated white rage. Our demand to vote, to have full participation in this democracy, to choose the representatives who will choose the kinds of policies that will govern our lives. Because we didn't sit down, but demanded to vote, marched to vote, died to vote. For Barack Obama, when he brought 15 million new voters into the polls in 2008, overwhelmingly Black, Latino, Asian, and poor, when you begin to think about voter suppression laws, they targeted Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and the poor. Now, we have a narrative that we value democracy and that everybody can vote. If you're eligible, you can vote. But then we have systematically put in rules. We have created obstacles and then created obstacles to those obstacles in order to ensure that Black people didn't vote, that Latinos didn't vote, that Asians didn't vote, and that the poor didn't vote. And so being able to put that into historical context, to show it happening over time, over and over and over again. So, public response.
You got death threats.
Ooh, yeah. Okay, so I had one guy say, "Why don't you put your crack pipe down?" I'm like, "Why I gotta be on crack? Why not meth?" or I had one guy was like, "You know, Dr. Vervoort had it right in apartheid South Africa. We need to lock you Negro criminals up away from us."
So to be confronted with the facts of history.
Boom. And that was why it was really so important for me in writing White Rage the way it was for you with Native Guard, is that's why it's footnote after footnote after footnote after footnote. This isn't a polemic. These are facts. And so I had, one guy, "Oh, you're racist." I said, "Did I shut down the Prince Edward County schools for 5 years?" That's a fact. And so when we wrestle with the facts, then we begin to have to wrestle with the truth. And so that's why it was so important for me to document everything. Because I felt the need in this society that had been so pulled away from the moorings of facts to try to pull us back. Another response that I've had besides death threats, I've got those. Man wrote, he said, "I'm a 70-year-old white man from St. Louis. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what it was. Thank you." And I had another guy said, "I'm a white police officer." And I'm like, "Okay, keep reading, Carol." He said, "I read White Rage. It opened my eyes. Thank you." So what I firmly believe is that, yes, there are some folks that you're just not going to get to. They have been stewed and immersed and baptized in hatred and in lies and in mythologies for so long that is their universe. And it's like massive cognitive dissonance. It's like having almost a psychotic break to have to come out of that, because then they have to rethink everything And that rethinking is going to require a lot of work. And most folk don't want to do that kind of work. But then there's another group of folk who don't want this mess, but they don't know how we got here. They just know that here is really unsettling. They know that here sucks. That's the scholarly term. And they want to know, how did we get here? Because if we can figure out how we got here, then we can figure out what we need to do to make sure that we get out and that we don't come back here again. And so that's why White Rage emerged, because I wanted to have some way of talking with the public about how we got here, and to understand that we pay so much attention, as Jessica noted when I talked about, we pay so much attention to the flames, like we paid attention to Charlottesville and the tiki torches. At that very moment, the Secretary of State in Georgia was purging over 500,000 people off of the voter rolls. That we missed the policies. And it's by paying attention to those policies, what's happening in our school board meetings, what's happening in our zoning law meetings, what's happening in our legislature as they're dealing with protecting the integrity of the ballot box, that we then begin to know how to engage this thing called white rage, and to diffuse its power. Because we give it power, we can take that power away.
I want to turn from there to emotional truths in each of your works, which I think you're on slightly different registers emotionally when you write. So I want to start with White Rage, the title of your book. And I feel like on the one hand, a lot of people are writing about white resentment. I'm not sure if rage is used in a lot of these books, but it's a very contemporary condition, as if it's temporary. It's this moment, it's this weird moment, it's post-2008, white people are suddenly, and you're giving this longer history, which is very instructive. In addition, though, I think you're one of the few black women, and I don't know if you've done a survey, but to write about white rage. And when I think about you writing about white rage, I also think about this idea of the angry black woman.
Boom.
And so I guess what that made me think about is, what's the difference between rage and anger? Have people claim that you're the angry black woman? But when you write, I mean, I know when I've written about some things, I do get mad. And what is the place of your own anger or emotion as you're writing, dealing with, really, it's a pretty horrific history. When yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, I have been called the angry black woman. I'm like, and? That's all you got? What is it, Shaka Khan? Is that all there is? And so I just that off, because what I'm really looking at, again, by being evidence-based, it deals with a lot of that mess. So like I said, when a guy's like, you're racist, did I shut down the schools for 5 years? Yes, no. Okay. And you just keep moving. Did I institute the black codes? Yes, no. Did I launch massive resistance? Yes, no. Okay then. I have a bit of snark in me, if you haven't been able to tell. And so when I was writing, sometimes I had to pull the snark out. Yeah, so first time I'd write it up the way I wanted to. Yeah. And then I'd go back going, okay, you take that out. Okay, you gotta take that out, or you gotta take that out. And I was like, okay, that's still getting there, but now your snark's not there. Sometimes it was really hard. So let me tell you, so like when I was doing Eyes Off the Prize, and there's a segment in there where I'm dealing with the Genocide Convention. And the Civil Rights Congress is charging the United States with committing genocide against African Americans. And there's all of this stuff about genocide. And I'm in the National Archives, and I'm in the State Department papers, and I'm in the legal department's papers. And there's this document that says, I think we can sign the Genocide Convention. Because remember, a treaty becomes the law of the land. I think we can sign the Genocide Convention because not enough Negroes have been lynched yet to constitute genocide. I just had to put the document down. I got up and I walked out the building because the anger at that moment was real. Because there was such a clinical antiseptic discussion. Disposability. I had the same anger and when I started chapter 2 in White Rage, because there I deal with the lynching of Mary Turner, who was a black woman who was angry because her husband was lynched for no good reason except that he was black. And the townsfolk wanted to send a message. Mary was pregnant. And they stripped her, hung her upside down, poured gasoline over her. She was 8 months pregnant. And set her on fire. And when they saw her stomach quivering, they took a knife and they sliced open her stomach and the baby popped out. And then they stomped on the baby's head. And so as I'm reading these descriptions, and as they're talking about the baby whimpering before they put the heel of, and I'm just like, really? And so, so one of the things that you hear is that historians must be dispassionate. We don't have to be dispassionate, we have to be evidence-based. And we have to write so that the stories themselves are doing this work. And we don't lose our sense of humanity. So I know that I'm telling these stories. These are the stories of my folk, of my great-grandfather who was enslaved, of my uncle who had to be put into the back of a truck with hay covering him as my grandfather is driving him out of Oklahoma so he doesn't get lynched. Of my mother who had to leave home when she was young so that because her schooling stopped at 6th grade so that she could go to Kansas City so she could continue her education because she knew that she deserved more than a 6th grade education. I mean, these are our stories. And I don't lose that sense of it. So yes, the emotion is there. And I'm telling it through the evidence because if we're going to understand how we got here, we got to know this. We have to know this.
I have a slightly different question to ask you, Natasha, but it's also about the emotional truths in your work. Over the course of your books, from domestic work forward, and now as you're working on this memoir about your mother's death, I've seen you slowly reveal that piece about your mother more and more. It was in Native Guard. It's almost as if you're uncovering layers of truths around it. I mean, it's not that you haven't ever, but that it's like at the heart. And now you're soon going to let us at the heart of that. And so your works, for me, often occupy and explore a space of grieving, of regret. There's a lot about memory and memorialization and the work of memory. And you said that as a writer, you're creating, quote, a monument to the lesser-known parts of history. And in fact, you said that just a few minutes ago. So I guess my question is a little bit about, it's taken you a bit to get to the very personal in your work. It's always there, it animated your work, but domestic work started historically, so did Native Guard. But now you've turned to this memoir, which is completely personal in some ways, the second memoir. Even the first memoir was more about your brother than it was about you. So how do you see the intersection of really the very personal, the singular, even though there's a commonality within that? And how are you thinking about history in relationship to the singularity of your own story?
Well, every time Carol is insisting on evidence, and your last description of trying to be dispassionate about things that are so hard to be dispassionate about. I think it takes a measure of sang-froid to be able to write the facts, to be able to have an accounting of these things that have happened. And starting out in my career as a poet, that's what I was trying to do. I wanted to try to remove as much of the wound that was beneath the surface from what I was writing, because I felt like that was the only way to gain a kind of authority. Evidence is authority. And so I was just going to present. I wasn't going to do too much interpretation. I felt that if I just showed you the facts of history, you would reach the conclusion that made sense, the one that is about justice. And so it has taken me years to kind of feel that there is a different kind of authority. So in each book was a little different. By the time I got to the end of Native Guard, I said something surprising to myself. The last poem in the book ends with the lines, "I returned to Mississippi, state that made a crime of me. Mulatto, half-breed, native, in my native land, this place, they'll bury me." I was surprised that I was willing to say that Mississippi made a crime of me. That's me saying it, as opposed to using a poem to somehow quote the statute, from Mississippi's it was a different thing. And I knew that that was me moving in a slightly different direction. So by the time I was working on Thrall, I still had a historical question. And that question for me was about how far back could I go to find the roots of what I see as, and this goes to white rage and why I wanted to talk to Carol today anyway. I mean, this is a book that's very much about deeply ingrained and unexamined notions of racial difference, the bedrock of white supremacy, contemporary white supremacy. I mean, every time I just read it in the New York Times again yesterday, something about all of these voters, whatever, and of course, they're not racist. We just so easily say that people aren't racist, and forgive me if it sounds like I'm about to say that people are racist, but what I'm saying is the deeply ingrained and unexamined notions of racial difference and racial hierarchy. That's white supremacy. And my beloved father, my white parent, still harbored some of those notions. And I wanted to write about that history, the history of ideas about racial hierarchy across time and space. And I was using evidence, I was using art, I was using the archives yet again. But even more so, the authority that I had in that collection was the personal truth, the personal experience. I felt that I was able to write and to make a kind of indictment about our contemporary moment by talking about the difficulties within the intimate relationships in families. How my beloved white father could also think that I was less than, that his infusion of whiteness made me better, improved upon what my mother might have had without his improvement.
Wow.
There's an authority in being able to say, this, I've lived it. This is in my family.
Yeah.
So if my beloved father's like this, you're going to tell me that maybe you're not. You've not had some little, or you don't know somebody who harbors it, lovely as they may be. That was the emotional truth of getting at that. It was a way of getting at the historical record. I was using the personal to get at that larger, as opposed to the other way around, which I had been doing, for so many years. I will tell a brief story, though, about this idea of truth and fact and the way it played out for me in terms of an emotional truth in a poem, in a pair of poems. When I was working on Native Guard, there was a day that I was jogging through the graveyard that was near my house, and there was a big Confederate part of the cemetery. And I stopped that day, and I couldn't help reading aloud all the names on those tombstones. It was as if they were demanding that I recognize them as well. And so when I got home, I thought, well, I've been writing about these black Union soldiers. Maybe I should write a poem about these Confederate soldiers too. But when I sat down to write, what came out was a poem about the day we buried my mother, about being in the graveyard. And this was a point early on in writing the book that I just thought I was writing about history, public history, not about the intersections between personal and public history, or the absences and omissions, and the contentions between the two. But when I sat down and wrote that poem, it ended with a couplet. I wander now among names of the dead, my mother's name, stone pillow for my head. And what I was trying to get at was the emotional truth, the idea that if you were grieving, you might be able to go to the graveyard and lay your head down on the stone of your beloved. It would be a cold comfort, but you would be somehow communing. And I knew it was right for the emotional truth of the poem, but it was a lie. It was untrue because I had never put a stone on my mother's grave. She did not have one. She was unmarked in the ground. And it was at that moment that I realized what she had in common with those black Union soldiers. The kind of erasure, the not proper memorialization and remembering that it would have been our duty as citizens and my duty as a daughter to do. And because of that, because I didn't like telling a lie, something that was not a fact, even as it was the emotional truth, I had to write another poem called Monument that was about having not done that thing. That's how much both truth and fact matter to me, that I'm going to find a way to tell the factual truth at the same time that I'm telling the emotional truth.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. Wow.
So my final set of questions. Carol, historians for most of the 20th century have been told that using our personal truths is not
Das verboten.
right, is not professional.
Yeah.
So does writing history, though, provide you with a way to manage your own personal experiences and truths as well?
Wow, that's a great question, Leslie. No. That's wow. Just said that. And so let me back up. Let me back up. When I am writing academic histories, Eyes Off the Prize, Bourgeois Radicals, the next one that I've got rolling through my head, The Ties, The Silence. Those works are about these kinds of larger swaths of history, understanding the tectonic plates that are moving history. I find that in my writing in the public sphere, particularly the op-eds and a longer piece that I did one on the politics of respectability for Literary Hub, that those pieces then speak more to the way that I move and live through this nation. And I bring in the way that I was raised. So part of what it is I talk about, as a child, I watched my neighborhood turn into the hood. And in trying to figure out how does that happen when you have a community full of God-fearing folk, where you walk into their house and I say, they have the Trinity sitting up there on their mantelpiece, right? Jesus Christ, Martin Luther King, and JFK. Some might have Abraham Lincoln, but it's usually JFK. And so when you've got these folks who are, getting up early in the morning to go to the factory, to go, to go do that work, and watching all of that effort, all of that love, all of that work to raise their families being just systematically destroyed. And seeing people, and again, this is how I was raised, and my father was one of those who was president of the South Linden Leadership Group and who was fighting City Hall tooth and nail when you come to pick up the trash. When you're fighting City Hall for basic stuff, you're in Chicago, you know what I'm talking about. When you're just fighting for basic stuff, that comes through more in my op-ed pieces and more in my public scholarship and more in my kind of public talks, because I weave them together much more seamlessly. The history piece in terms of the kind of, published by University Press stuff. That is me dealing with these kind of big historical issues, and I do see that part of what creeps in that helps is that seeing how communities have had to fight and be ignored, seeing in a previous life where I was in full-blown administration, so in government, so I know how to read a memo. And know the dangers of the passive voice. It was decided. And I know exactly what that means. That has helped, but I somehow I split that part, probably to keep my sanity.
And my final question for Natasha. What has been your experience of being seen as an historian as well as a poet? I mean, you really bring these two together. So how do you think about yourself? I mean, I know, of course, that you're a poet, but you're so historically rooted and grounded. How do you ever go on a plane and say, I'm an historian?
I should try that. Because when I say I'm a poet,
you would only tell my profession if you did.
I don't know, because you said earlier when you say you're a historian and people start talking about how much they, either they
then
love.
You could say, but read this poem, it's short.
Well, when I say I'm a poet, they say, so am I, and then so I may try out historian. I think I wish that I were a historian. I can't say that I'd be a good one, but I certainly try as much as I can to do the work of history in poetry. And it has everything to do with, again, as I've said before, confronting from a very early age absence, erasure, and amnesia. Being in classrooms where I was told things that I knew from personal experience and from the stories passed down in my family couldn't be quite right. But that was the steady diet that all of us were being fed. And wanting to push back against that, to push back indeed against types of received knowledge that have always told me that I was second class, less than, all these things. It seemed to me that the way that I could do that kind of work was in the way that Seamus Heaney talks about the redress of poetry. that for the people who weren't going to read professional historians, that maybe there was another way to get to them, just as theater or dance or the other arts can get to us and tell us certain things about history that we may not know, but might be another way that we would come to it. Poetry is a way that I think people can listen because of the intimacy of the voice, and if it can do the work of history too, that's when I feel happiest. You know, I'll say this last thing. I mean, years ago I found a book called The Historian as Detective. You know, this old book? Yeah. So it caught my attention because it was a bright yellow cover and it had a magnifying glass and a deerstalker hat. And so I was into murder mysteries too. So I thought, oh, this looks like Sherlock Holmes and the magnifying glass. But I also was always looking at my OED with a magnifying glass. So it seemed to me that is sort of the image of a scholar, with that. And there were 3 chapters that caught my attention. One was called On Believing What One Reads. And that was very much like getting those textbooks that were commissioned by the Daughters of the Confederacy to tell a certain story about the Civil War and the aftermath, and erasing and denying another one. The second one was What is Evidence? And the third was On the Pleasures of Doubt. And I think it's always with the pleasures of doubt in mind that I approach even the histories I think I know.
Yeah. Yes. Wow.
On that note, we'll end.
Before we turn to Q&A, I was wondering, Natasha, if you'd be willing to read your poem, Southern History.
Southern History.
So folks can get a sense of the art as well.
I'm glad you asked. I'm glad I told that story before you asked, because this is a poem that I wrote after the chapter in that book I just mentioned called On Believing What One Reads. Southern History. Before the war, they were happy, he said, quoting our textbook. This was senior year history class. The slaves were clothed, fed, and better off under a master's care. I watched the words blur on the page. No one raised a hand, disagreed, not even me. It was late. We still had Reconstruction to cover before the test, and, luckily, 3 hours of watching Gone with the Wind. History, the teacher said, of the Old South, a true account of how things were back then. On screen, a slave stood big as life, big mouth, bucked eyes, our textbooks grinning proof. A lie my teacher guarded. Silent, so did I.
Wow.
Anthropology. I want to thank all 3 of you so very much. There are things of yours I've read, and now there's so much more that I have yet to read. But specifically, I want to address Carol Anderson. I'm the Northwestern professor who wrote to you 3 years ago about the Washington Post op-ed to thank you. And you actually answered me, and thank you so much for responding, given the flood of crap that you received as well. And I want you to know I've been using that endlessly in my teaching, and I pair it with Richard Rothstein on The Making of Ferguson, and it works. Yes. And the students get it, and I want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd just like to ask you, Professor Trethewey, to talk a little bit about persona work. You do so much interesting persona work in your book. it's neither fiction or nonfiction, right? And
Yeah.
you're in a third space. Or it's neither in both, right? And, and sometimes I run into students who are confused about persona, and confused about how to access truth through persona. Right? They feel like if I'm not speaking as myself, then I tell the truth. And so I just love to hear you speak.
Thanks, Eula. That was a great question. It seemed, I've talked a little bit about doing that with the Native Guard, that because I was using the evidence, that there's that kind of truth, the truth of the historical fact in there, but that the other truth is something slipperier, that emotional truth, that truth to the experience of an imagined character. This was perhaps strangely easier, and I think you mentioned this in your introduction when I wrote about Belloc's Ophelia. I mean, there was a funny way that that you said it. I almost chuckled because you indeed said using my personal experience, and then you immediately said these prostitutes in. No. I mean, it was just those two things side by side, and indeed, but you were right. I mean, I did a lot of research. I've actually had to say to classes of students, no, I've never been a prostitute, nor was I born in, was I alive in 1910. I've had people say, so what was it like back in New Orleans then? But what I did give that character was a great measure of my internal life. I think it was Kundera who said that all of his characters are unrealized parts of himself. And that to be able to give to a character something of your own emotional life makes for, I think, a true character. It involves, of course, a great deal of empathy to be able to inhabit someone who is from a different time and place and unlike you in so many ways. I gave her not only my emotional life, what it meant. I create a character who's always being looked at by the camera. She's being photographed. And that comes out of me growing up in the Deep South, constantly being looked at, and being asked, what are you? So from that, I have a way to access what she might have felt. I gave her also some actual events that had happened to me. There's a moment that she's talking about the man who was her father that she knew very briefly when she was a child, that comes exactly out of something that my father used to do. When my parents were divorced, I would see my father in the summer, and the first thing he'd do when he saw me was grab my hand and turn it over and look at my fingernails to see if my fingernails were clean. Now, this may be a thing that lots of parents do. I don't know of your experience, but because my father was white and I was a black child and this was Mississippi, even then, something of the inspection to me felt like the way that slaves on the auction block were inspected, looking at the teeth or these various things. And so I give to her that. My father was also an English professor and a poet. If I made any mistakes in grammar, there was always him stopping me. And I always felt like I had to prove to my father that I was smart. Things like that I give to her, and it becomes tinged even more with race and that historical moment that she lives in. But all of it comes from, and those poems, I think this is probably what you're getting at as a teacher of creative writing also. I feel that the poems that are the most true, the most emotionally true, are the ones where the mask is the thickest. And that is a thicker mask. No, I write personal poems, but as Leslie mentioned, in many ways I try to distance myself from those. But when I put on that mask, there's nothing I won't do or say.
More questions?
Okay, maybe I should get like closer or something. I don't know. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I'm loud. Okay. This is mostly for Ms. Anderson, but so I don't know if y'all know the court case Shelby County versus Boulder, 2013, I think. Had to do with it. Yeah, I was going to say that was it's been talked about. I've heard it talked about is gutting the pre-clearance section of the 65 Voting Rights Act. And since you were talking about voting and like restrictions to voting, I just wanted to hear kind of what you thought about that and if anyone's talked about that to you.
In fact, that's the next book. That's the one I'm writing right now. So
It's the afterword to the new edition of White Rage.
yeah, I mean, it's just it grew out of so the Shelby County v. Holder decision, and that is where the Supreme Court looked at the Voting Rights Act, and in a decision, a 5-4 decision written by Chief Justice John Roberts, basically gutted Section 4, which are the guidelines that then allow states to be then put under the pre-clearance provision, which means that anything you do to change your voting requirements has to then be approved by the Department of Justice or by the court in D.C., the federal court in D.C. And now, in order to get under the guidelines of the Voting Rights Act, it required two things. One, in the 1964 election, you had to have fewer than 50% of your voting age eligible adults registered to vote. Fewer than 50%. And that you had to have some kind of device, a device such as a literacy test that helped mark your eligibility, your ability to be able to vote. If you had those two things, you were then put under the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act had been reauthorized several times over. The last time was in 2006, after a series of hearings and a mound of evidence. Many of the same states and locales were still under the provisions of the Voting Rights Act in 2006 that had been there in 1965. Now, the Voting Rights Act provided an ability to bail out. That has to be real clear. And to bail out, it meant that you stopped discriminating against your people. This is in the land of folks. This isn't hard. Stop discriminating against your people. For 50 years, they couldn't quite figure out how to stop discriminating against their people. By the time the Voting Rights Act, by the time of Shelby County v. Holder, the Department of Justice had blocked 700 changes that had been proposed by the different states and locales under the Voting Rights Act, under the pre-clearance provision. 700 since 1965. So that meant that folks were still trying. It also had a bail-in provision, which said, okay, you weren't there in 65, but Lord, didn't you just get up and start acting a fool? Look at you. And they would put these states under the provisions of the Voting Rights Act, or areas of those states. So areas in New York, areas in California, areas in Arizona, areas in Connecticut. But what Roberts said was that the Voting Rights Act was stagnant and static. That none of these changes were happening because only 17 areas had been bailed out, and certainly Congress couldn't have meant that to happen. He also said that it was punitive against the South, that it was picking on the South. And that, so I'm going to tell a quick story here. I'm a storyteller. So this reminds me of when we were little kids, and my brother would haul off and hit me. Now, there were a lot of provocative things that I was doing right before that hit, I must admit. But I would say, "Money, windows picking on me," and she turned to me and she said, "What you doing to make yourself so pickable?"
Yep.
The South had made itself pickable,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know, it was, they were doing all kinds of stuff, redrawing district boundaries to try to dilute the power of the black vote, trying to institute new forms of literacy tests. I mean, they just kept at it.
IDs.
Oh, so when they gutted, so the moment that they gutted the Voting Rights Act, 2 hours later, Texas passed SB 14, which was one of the most draconian laws dealing with voting rights, requiring not just a government-issued photo ID, but a certain type of government-issued photo ID. So, and just like North Carolina and these other states, they figured out the kinds that black people and that Latinos did not have. And then they said, okay, yeah, that's the one. Yeah, that's it. And they also don't like students, because, you know, students tend to be liberals. Yeah, when you start reading through these court documents, and this is what they're saying, like up in Wisconsin, students are liberals. We got to stop these liberals from voting. So they were doing things like no student IDs, even if it's a government, you know, a public university. Your university ID doesn't count. In Alabama said you had to have a government-issued photo ID. Public housing ID didn't count. I'm like, do you get more public and government than public housing? I'm just saying. Just help me here right now. Maybe I missed something. But this was a way to get at the fact that you had massive poverty rates among blacks and among Latinos. And so it was a way to X them out. Also then to say, then what you have to have is a license, driver's license, thank you, a driver's license. Then what Alabama did, Lord bless their hearts, that was Southern, wasn't it? Yeah. Was then they shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties. So now, and you don't have a public transportation system. So now you have to go 2-3 counties over, but you don't drive because you don't have a driver's license. How am I doing so far? Right? So now you've got to go 2-3 counties over in order to get a driver's license, but you don't drive and there's not a public transportation system. How this worked in Texas? Texas figured out, just as it was passing its law, that Texas only has Department of Motor Vehicles in 1/3 of its counties. 2/3 of its counties do not have a Department of Motor Vehicles. People would have to go about 150 miles, no, 250 miles, yeah, 250 miles to get to the nearest Department of Motor Vehicles. And we don't have a public transportation system. So Texas originally in SB 14 said, okay, so we will reimburse folk for having to basically do a 500-mile round trip. And then they put an X through that right before they passed the bill. So now basically what you have is a poll tax, because now you're going to have to pay somebody to drive you to go get your driver's license. And so that's why in the 2016 election, African American voter turnout dropped by 7%. Now what you heard, and this is where I talk about the narrative of black pathology, what you heard was, Lord, black folk didn't go out and vote. Look at them, black folks just stayed home. Just stayed home. What is wrong with black people? Look at them staying home. They knew Trump was on the ballot, but you know what? They weren't feeling Hillary. How am I doing? How many heard that?
Well, they only went to vote last time because they got to vote for a black person, right? I mean, that's the only reason they voted in the first place.
Right, because every time on the ballot there has been a black person running for president. So this is evidence-based. This is what I'm talking about. I put this in the God, Mother, Duck category. So, here we have this narrative of black pathology just staying home without the acknowledgement that this was the first presidential election without the protections of the Voting Rights Act. And these states acted a stone cold fool. And they're continuing to do so. I mean, when you're looking at what the Kobach Commission, the Election Integrity Commission, you want to talk about a misnomer. It's like as much as a misnomer as the Patriot Act. Right? You know, when you're looking at that, when you're looking at the continued wrangling over voter IDs, the continuing wrangling, the Supreme Court case right now in terms of gerrymandering. When you're looking at, one of the things that happened is that states that had been under pre-clearance, they closed their polling places in minority districts, so that there were almost 900 fewer polling places in 2016 than there had been in 2012. And those were under the pre-clearance states, because now they could close those polls, because what they know is, one, if you've got working class folk, that it's really hard to have to stay in the line for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours to vote, because you are now losing money because you're getting your pay docked. They also know, and Harvard's done a wonderful study on this, is that people who have to stay in line for a long time, one, they're like, I'm not voting, I can't afford to do this. But not only do you dissuade that voter, you dissuade members of their families as well. So we know this, they know this, and that's why I talk about, and again, think about this. When you reduce the voting turnout rate by 7% in a close election, and it was not done with a Klan cross burning. Not at all. It's done by folks in suits. Done in beautiful, clinical, democratic language. We must protect the integrity of the ballot box. We must reassure the American public that our elections are sacred and safe and secure. How many times have we heard this as these massive voter suppression laws come through that are targeted, as the Fourth Circuit said about North Carolina, targeted African Americans with nearly surgical precision. And it works. So.
Well, we have our work cut out for us.
Which is why
Join
we're
me in
talking more
thanking,
about voter fraud than voter suppression. So we're looking at the flames instead of the kindling.
Yes, that thing is a smoke screen